Thanks everyone for joining this webinar. I'm Tony Rothgilly. I'm Professor of Energy Systems at Durham University, and I lead the EPSRC network for hydrogen fuel transportation, which is a webinar is part of a series that we are organizing to look at different aspects of hydrogen research in the transport sector. So this week we are welcoming two speakers on the subject of hydrogen production and supply for transport, and they will be giving their own thoughts from an academic and a policy perspective. Our first speaker is Martin Lambert. Martin joined the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies in 2017 and now specialises in renewable gas and hydrogen, while also writing occasionally on global LNG. He also works as an independent consultant. His areas of expertise include commercial strategy, project development and structuring, economics, gas and LNG markets and trading. He's going to give us a presentation on hydrogen production supply challenges and transport applications. So over to you, Martin.
Okay, thanks very much, Tony, for the introduction, and hello everyone. So I'm from the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. We're an independent think tank based in Oxford in the UK, and we look at all aspects of the energy system from short-term things like the current very high gas prices and why that is, but increasingly we're focused on the energy transition. And as Tony said, I look at hydrogen and renewable gases for the Institute. Prior to that, working for Shell, I was in the mainstream gas and LNG business. So interesting transition there. For today, though, I've now been asked to look at hydrogen production and supply and its relevance to transport applications. And so I'll focus mainly on the UK, but some of that is more general, and I'll try and pick up on some international or European perspectives as appropriate, and then we can always pick up on other aspects like that in the Q&A. So if I move on one slide, hopefully that's moved on your screen too. This is kind of the one slide summary of what I'm going to talk about over the next few slides. And really the message is that we talk about hydrogen as being a new thing, but actually there's plenty of hydrogen being used already, but the challenge now is to move to low carbon or even zero carbon hydrogen. I'll talk a bit about the colours of hydrogen, so blue and green, what that means and the pros and cons of each, and then the challenge of getting to scale, which is, I mean, in the whole decarbonisation debate, scale and cost are pretty challenging just because the energy system is so big. And so we can have lots of interesting projects around, but trying to make them actually significant in terms of scale of the energy system, that's a major challenge. A message that will come through a few times is, and applies definitely in the transport area, but in other areas too, is that direct electrification is probably going to be better wherever it's feasible. And so hydrogen and other options pick up the places where direct electrification isn't suitable for some reason. And then building on that, that means that hydrogen is needed for some transport sectors, but not for others. So light duty, I think battery electric vehicles are kind of won the race there. Long distance heavy duty transport is likely to need hydrogen. So a bit more on that later, but there's a question around where the boundary comes between long distance heavy duty and light duty. So, and that will depend on technology developments and choices. Important area for hydrogen, ocean going shipping. I'll talk more on that in a moment. And aviation is another hard to decarbonize area where hydrogen will certainly play an important role. So that's the overall story. In the next few slides, I'll unpack some of those points. So first of all, these are a few charts. This is now a bit of a European perspective from a study which I did earlier this year with a colleague from Germany. And you can see that on the right-hand chart, that's the amount of hydrogen already being used in the various countries. Perhaps not a big surprise, Germany and the Netherlands are the biggest in Europe because they're kind of the big industrial heartlands. But the UK is also significant. If those who prefer tons, that 23 terawatt hours there equates to about 0.7 million tons. That's nearly all used in refining, so oil refining, petrochemicals, and making ammonia. And as I'll show on the next couple of slides, that's all produced from fossil fuels and therefore emits quite a lot of carbon dioxide along with it. So certainly isn't a low carbon fuel at all. Also, just an aside on this slide, worth noting, the left-hand chart, just for comparison, is the current natural gas demand in all those countries. And you can see it's an order of magnitude, so 10 times the size in terms of the scale of gas demand and hydrogen. So just to underline the comment I made before about the energy system is really big and scaling up is going to be a challenge. So these next few slides are just a very brief look at sort of hydrogen production technology. This may be familiar to many of you, but I thought I'd run through it quickly, not least because there's some interesting terminology. People talk about grey hydrogen quite a lot, which is kind of how it's produced today. I mean, in some parts of the world, hydrogen is made from coal or from oil, but the vast majority is made from natural gas through a process called methane reforming, and that produces hydrogen. But the important point for this slide is that for every ton of hydrogen that you get 10 tons of carbon dioxide emitted. So for that UK number, for 0.7 million tons a year of hydrogen in the UK produces 7 million tons of carbon dioxide. People talk a lot about blue hydrogen, and particularly in the UK. So blue hydrogen is just all of that same process as before, but you can capture the carbon dioxide and then you can pipe it to somewhere, typically offshore, put it in a disused gas field or other underground structure geologically and store the CO2, and that turns it into blue hydrogen. As a sort of technical aside, the process of methane reforming, there's two different technologies, and most hydrogen today is from this steam methane process. The subtly different autothermal reforming process is actually produces more concentrated CO2, and so therefore is better if you want to capture the CO2. So that's grey hydrogen and blue hydrogen. But then what many policymakers, particularly in Europe, but I think also in the UK, see as the long-term holy grail, is a thing called green hydrogen, which is also talked about as in the context of sector integration. So there's a few clicks here, I can explain what's going on. So the idea is that hydrogen is made by splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen, and through a process called electrolysis, which has been around for well over 100 years, so nothing particularly new there. What is new is producing it from renewable electricity, and by producing it from renewable electricity, that means that it's effectively zero carbon hydrogen. In the case of the carbon capture and storage, there's still probably about 10% of the CO2 not captured, and that's why green hydrogen is preferred. But it's also liked because once you've made the hydrogen, and you can either store it and use it for industry or for transport. Nice hydrogen bus there in my picture. Or you can blend it into the gas grid, which is a fairly easy way to dispose of the hydrogen when you first make it. And then longer term, you can also then perhaps you can then use the hydrogen to combine with some carbon dioxide, preferably from a biogas plant, so biogenic carbon dioxide, you can then combine that with make methane, and then you've got a synthetic methane, which can then go into the grid. So that's why this green hydrogen is then seen as being really interesting, because it integrates the electricity network with the gas network and can bring together the energy system in a sort of reasonably new and innovative way. Right, so that was the background on what green and blue mean. I said at the start that cost and scale are the big challenges, and this is an illustration of the way in which cost is a substantial challenge. So on this slide, starting from the bottom up, you can see that blue hydrogen is a small premium, but only relatively small, over grey hydrogen. So adding carbon capture and storage clearly has a cost, but in the right locations, like in the east coast of the UK, for example, not a huge additional cost. And so the cost of hydrogen does go up a bit. This chart makes assumptions about carbon pricing increasing. And so as carbon prices increase, you can see that actually the cost of blue hydrogen is then equivalent to grey hydrogen, effectively saying that once carbon prices are, say, above 80 euros a tonne or thereabouts, then blue hydrogen is probably economically preferable to grey hydrogen. On the other hand, green hydrogen currently is really very expensive, and that's because it's a combination of the price of renewable power and also the price of electrolyzers. So the kit used to make hydrogen is made largely very small scale currently, and therefore it's quite expensive. It's projected to come down in the future, as the graph shows, but that will require quite a lot of things to happen right for renewable power to come down in price, and also for the price of electrolyzers to fall. And that means building large-scale green hydrogen plants so as to get up the learning curve to bring those costs down. So against that background, we tend to say, just as an aside, that's a indication of where we think gas prices would be over the long term. So natural gas is definitely cheaper than hydrogen of any sort. Gas prices, there's been all the stuff in the press about the current high gas prices. Looking at that right-hand scale, the current high gas prices are around about $30 per million BTU. So that kind of puts in context. So the current gas prices that everyone's getting excited about are around about the level of where hydrogen will be in the future. So back onto the blue and then green story. The top charts there is just another way of looking at the same thing around blue being cheaper than green for the time being. But another reason why we believe that blue hydrogen ought to be preferred is from the top line of the table underneath. You can see the carbon intensity of the electricity on the power grids in each of those countries. And that means effectively there's more work that renewable power has to do to lower the carbon intensity of power generation. So if you divert lots of renewable power for making green hydrogen, then it's arguable whether it's very green at all, because you could have used the electrons to decarbonize the power grid. So implicitly, you're making your hydrogen from fossil fuels by a rather expensive indirect route. This chart then zooms in a bit on the UK. And the UK is actually one of the few countries in Europe where the blue, then green hydrogen argument has been, understood and bought into by policymakers. So the UK actually is putting quite a lot of focus on blue hydrogen. The top left-hand chart is from the National Grid future energy scenarios. So UK National Grid produce scenarios each year. And what you can see is there's quite a wide range of expectations of production of blue and green hydrogen by the time you get out to 2050. And that will depend on policy, which way you get there. We're talking about transport today, so I think it's important to note that out of all the uses of hydrogen envisaged in scenarios, about somewhere between 20 and 50 terawatt hours of hydrogen is for transport. So it's part of the picture, but not necessarily a huge part of the picture. That just puts in context, but we're talking about supply today, and that's where supply would come from, so a mix of blue and green. Also, hot off the press news in the last week or so is that the UK government has been talking some time about supporting 2 carbon capture and storage projects initially, and then 2 more after that. And it's recently been announced that the so-called North East England cluster around Humberside and Teesside, that's one of the priority projects. And the other one is on Merseyside, the HyNet project. So they're starting to get in the UK some real traction on producing, well, I have to be slightly careful. So these are CCS projects, and making blue hydrogen is part of it, but only part of it. The projects are also about capturing carbon from industry and storing that. If I zoom out from the UK a bit and look at the wider Europe picture, so Europe, most countries, apart from perhaps UK, Netherlands, Norway, are almost entirely focused on green hydrogen. And green hydrogen has very much a scale challenge because the current biggest electrolyzer in operation in Europe is 10 megawatts at Shell's refinery in Germany. They've just announced they're expanding it to 100 megawatts. But in order to get to any significant amount of green hydrogen production, you need gigawatt scale production. And there's a couple of projects being talked about now at gigawatt scale, but they're still quite a long way from starting construction even. So the scale-up challenge, particularly for green hydrogen, cannot be underestimated. So if I move on now to look at application of hydrogen, and so where we see hydrogen really having a major role in the future and where it seems less likely. And so I talked at the start about existing hydrogen production. And so we see the first priority really is to decarbonize that hydrogen, either by carbon capture and storage or by adding green hydrogen instead. And making ammonia is a particular priority because ammonia, as we'll see, has quite an important role in the transition. Then there are new industrial applications like steel making and also for balancing power grids, because if you don't want to burn natural gas anymore when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, then hydrogen is a very good way to store the energy and then to use that long term. So those top 3, of course, don't cover transport. But one area where it's really important for transport is international marine. I've got a slide on that in a couple of slides' time. And also for aviation, for making synthetic liquid fuels, then hydrogen has a very important role there. Where we see it less important is in particularly light-duty road and rail transport because of batteries in competition. Blending in gas grids is a useful way to dispose of hydrogen in the short term, but isn't really a long-term way to decarbonize the system. And also, again, hot off the press, the UK government has announced its heat and building strategy, and that confirms what I say there. Electric heat pumps are way more efficient than hydrogen boilers, and so therefore that's probably going to be the preferred route wherever possible for decarbonising heat in buildings. Just to explain a bit about why hydrogen is only limited for light-duty transport. And the top left chart on this slide kind of tells the story quite well, because if you think of a long-term world where green hydrogen is the answer, then you'll be starting from electricity. If you then put it into an electrolyzer to make hydrogen, and then put it into a fuel cell to make effectively electricity again to then power your car, on the left-hand side of the left-hand chart, you can see the big loss in efficiency, and so the electrical input that you need to get to the electrical power that you want. Conversely, on the right-hand side of that chart, if you just use a battery, there are some losses, but they're relatively small. And that kind of is a good reason why, for those sort of applications, then it makes sense to use batteries. Also, there's a kind of critical mass story. So top right, I put in a nice picture of the Toyota Mirai, which is a fairly expensive vehicle to buy. And currently in the UK, there's only 11 fueling stations to fill it up. So people talk about the problem of charging electric cars, but at least there's a lot more options for that than there are for hydrogen. But then hydrogen, there's that train in Germany is operating on hydrogen, and there could be niches where electrification isn't appropriate, and then hydrogen may have a role. But typically for rail, you could see that batteries could cover much of the system there. Even if it hasn't been fully electrified, then you could have a train which is got overhead wires or picks up from overhead wires when required, and then uses batteries for the short bits where there isn't any electrification. Coming towards the end now, this is the story around shipping. So the International Maritime Organization had a big campaign up to 2020 to take sulfur out of marine fuel oil, and that was quite successful. The next target is to decarbonize shipping, and the options for that are fairly limited. So my story about electrification where possible, that applies to ferries, for example. So that has been done, particularly in Scandinavia, quite a lot of electric ferries operating. But for long-haul shipping, there are relatively few alternatives. And making ammonia from hydrogen seems to be probably the most promising alternative at this stage. In the table at the bottom left, I've got a bit of comparison with other options. All of them, of course, are pretty expensive compared to the current oil alternatives. But if you want to decarbonize, we can't carry on using oil. And so out of the options available, then ammonia is probably the most suitable for shipping. But that chart's also helpful because thinking about aviation, another hard to decarbonize transport sector, you might also need to have synthetic liquid fuels. The price of all those, you're looking at 3 to 4 times the current price of the fossil-derived product. And then just a final word. So these tables came from a publication we put out in May this year called the Oxford Energy Forum. It's a quarterly magazine. You can find it on our website, and that had lots of articles from different authors about the role of hydrogen in various applications in various countries around the world. So if you want to have a further read, then I can recommend having a look at that. And I'll hand back to Tony and look forward to a discussion in the Q&A later.
Okay, thank you, Martin.